For over 2 decades, my coven elders locked me in a cage of absolute, grueling emotional containment, forcing total psychological suppression just so I could finally stand in the same room as him again without tearing his world apart. Now the silence is over. I am back in the city, and our families have bound us together under the cold armor of a corporate contract. Jayden thinks he can fight this arrangement behind loud club music, tailored suits, and a blinding, perfect smile. He has no idea how long I have fought to stand before him without becoming a monster. I don't care about the contracts or the boardrooms. The cage is gone. The hunger is under control. And I am coming to claim my anchor. Chapter 1. The Golden Anchor. In my world, every relationship comes with a price tag. And my father just sold me for a 6-week performance. I spent 30 years learning how to disappear behind a perfect smile, treating my life like a strategic negotiation, wearing tailored suits like armor and measuring every word. But I never expected a contract to feel this final. To everyone else, I'm just a spoiled Omega running on excess. They think the parties, the music, and the neon lights prove I don't take anything seriously. They don't understand that it's the only time I'm actually alive, and not just an asset on a board. The bass from last night's launch party was still humming in the back of my skull, a dull, familiar rhythm that usually faded by my second espresso. People looked at my headlines, the late-night VIP booths, and assumed chaos. But they had it completely wrong. I genuinely, fiercely loved being alive. To me, energy was currency. The music, the flashing lights, and the unfiltered warmth of a crowded room weren't an escape. It was how I honored the sheer joy of living, reminding myself that beneath the tailored suits, my heart was actually beating. I worked hard. My division's quarterly revenue numbers proved I wasn't just riding on my family's name, so I earned the right to lose myself when the sun went down. Out on the floor, surrounded by people who only knew my easy laugh and the bright, sharp scent of citrus and sea salt that marked my secondary gender, I was just Jayden. Not a piece on a board to be hedged. "You're not listening to me, Jayden." My mother's voice shattered the low hum of my thoughts. She sat across from my massive mahogany desk, her polished nails tapping a precise, irritated rhythm against her leather handbag. "This isn't another press conference you can slide through on charm. Boston is back." "I heard you the first 3 times, Mom," I said, leaning back in my executive chair and spinning a heavy platinum pen. "The prodigal son returns. The vampire Enigma comes home to claim his throne. Am I supposed to throw a parade?" My father, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, turned slowly. His scent, heavy cedar and aged leather, flared with subtle authority, tightening the air in the office. "You will treat this with the seriousness it demands," my father said, his voice quiet, cold, and entirely unyielding. "The market is shifting. The merger between our firms isn't just a business move anymore. It's a structural necessity. An alliance with an Enigma Coven seals our standing for the next century." "I'm 30, I said, dropping the pen onto the blotter with a dull, sharp thud. "I run your entire creative marketing sector. I pull 14-hour days here before I step foot into a lounge. I am dedicated to this company. Why do I need to be treated like an 18th century bride?" "Because your dedication is messy, Jayden," my mother interjected smoothly, though her eyes were sharp. "Your work is flawless, yes, but your lifestyle is a liability. You party hard, you move too fast. An Omega with your blood profile needs stability. Someone who can anchor you. And Boston needs a public bridge to human society." Boston. The name pulled up a vague, grainy memory buried deep beneath 22 years of living. I was 8 when he left. I remembered a tall, quiet presence who never joined the rest of the alphas in the main pavilion during family summits. While the others projected arrogant power, Boston sat in the deepest shade of the oak trees, silent, watching the world with pale, unreadable eyes. Then his family sent him overseas. 22 years later, I knew only the official story. Ancestral estates in Europe, private vampire training, containment, discipline, and molding him into the rare, dominant Enigma force he was today. Enigmas were anomalies, pure-blood vampires capable of bending the traditional dynamics of alphas and omegas to their absolute will, possessing a sheer, quiet power that commanded respect without ever raising a voice. And my parents wanted to leash me to one. Or maybe they wanted him to leash me. "Boston has no interest in public life, Jayden," my father continued, stepping closer to my desk. "He is an immortal introvert in the truest sense. He operates from the dark, from behind closed doors, and he prefers it that way. But the board requires a face. They require balance. You are bright, warm, and social. He is absolute control. Together, you lock down both the public trust and the internal power of the coven. A golden anchor," I muttered, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of my monitor. He gets a social buffer and I get a vampire handler. You get a secure future, my mother corrected, rising from her chair and smoothing down her suit. The formal dinner is tonight at the estate. I expect you home by 6 to change. Wear something understated, Jayden. And for once, don't drown the room in citrus. When the door clicked shut behind them, the office fell dead silent. I let my head drop back against the leather headrest, closing my eyes. The thought of being tethered to someone who inhabited the silent dark sent a cold spike of panic through my chest. The flashing lights and crowded rooms were how I kept the suffocating expectations of my family name from crushing me. How was a fire supposed to survive trapped under a damp wool blanket? I stood up, walked to the glass window, and looked down at the sprawling city. Tonight, I was going to sit across a dining table from a ghost who had returned as a god. And if my parents thought I was going to quietly fold my hands and play the obedient, subdued Omega to an ancient vampire bloodline, they were in for a long night. Chapter 2, Heavy Silence and Neon Lights. I spent 45 minutes in front of my bedroom mirror, explicitly ignoring my mother's instruction to wear something understated. If I was being marched toward a golden cage, I was going to make sure everyone in the room felt the glare. I pulled on a tailored indigo silk shirt, unbuttoned just low enough to show the line of my collarbone, paired with fitted black trousers and silver rings. I spritzed a generous mist of bergamot and sea salt, letting the sharp citrus coat the air like a wall of defense, masking the warm pulse of my blood beneath. Downstairs, my phone buzzed incessantly. Leo, where are you? Tables reserved, the VIP lounge is packed. You better not flake on us tonight, Jay. I shot back a quick reply, stuck at the family dinner from hell. Give me an hour. I'm slipping out early. The thought of absolute freedom on the floor was the only thing keeping my blood circulating as I walked into the main dining hall of the estate. The atmosphere was suffocating. The air itself felt dense, weighed down by a presence that didn't need to make a sound to dominate. It held a stillness that was unnatural, because the creature sitting at the end of the table didn't need to breathe unless he chose to. Boston sat at the far end, flanked by his parents. He wore a sharp, minimalist charcoal turtleneck that made his broad shoulders look imposing without an ounce of effort. He was striking, dark hair cut precise, a razor-sharp jawline and pale, storm-gray eyes completely devoid of warmth. The moment I stepped across the threshold, Boston's posture went rigid. His pale eyes snapped directly to mine, his irises expanding until his pupils turned an abyssal, predatory black. Decades of containment shattered against his senses as the adult wave of my bergamot and sea salt washed over him. Outwardly, he didn't move an inch, but the veins along his strong neck tightened under his collar, his fingers subtly digging into the polished mahogany to anchor himself against the instinctual pull. The dark heat of his aura surged forward. Rainwater on frozen earth, crushed cedar and ozonic steel, curling around my scent like a predator coiling before a strike. Jayden, his father greeted smoothly, fangs barely visible behind a polished smile. You've grown. Jayden, my mother warned under her breath, her hand pressing into my back to force me forward. Good evening, I said, offering a practiced corporate smile as I took my seat directly across from him. Welcome back to the country, Boston. You have been away for quite some time. Boston didn't return the smile. He simply lifted his glass of water, his gray eyes tracking every twitch of my fingers, zeroing in on the rapid beat of the exposed pulse point at my neck. 22 years, Boston said, his voice low, smooth, and carrying a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate against the crystal stemware. You were smaller. And you were quieter, I shot back, resting my elbows on the table and lacing my fingers together. Though I see some things don't change. My father cleared his throat sharply, warning me with a heavy flare of cedar scent, but Boston's eyes didn't flicker. He looked at me with a quiet, analytical patience that made my skin itch. While our parents launched into a droning discussion about market acquisitions, I sat back, running a thumb over the screen of my phone beneath the tablecloth. 10:15 p.m. The club was reaching its peak. I didn't want to be analyzed by a vampire enigma who looked like he'd rather be buried in a quiet crypt. I take it you have somewhere else you'd rather be, Boston spoke up quietly, his voice cutting cleanly through our father's ongoing conversation. The table went dead silent. Excuse me? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Boston set his glass down without a sound. Your pulse is fast. Exactly 92 beats per minute. Your blood is pushing a sharp scent of bergamot through your skin every time your fingers tap against your knee. And your heart spikes every time your phone lights up. My mother froze. My father's jaw tightened. I leaned forward, dropping the polite front entirely. The scent of my bergamot and sea salt flared sharply between us, hitting him head-on. For a fraction of a second, Boston's jaw locked tighter. He drew in a slow, calculated breath through his nose, taking in the full wave of my scent, before his fingers subtly tightened around his glass. "I have a life outside of Coven contracts, Boston," I said coolly. "Some of us actually enjoy being alive." "Clearly," Boston replied coldly, his gaze dropping to the thrumming vein in my neck before locking back onto my eyes. "Though running off to drown your blood in noise and liquor hardly strikes me as living. It looks like escaping." A cold heat flushed up my neck. "Well, some of us don't have the luxury of hiding in the dark," I said, standing up and smoothing down my silk shirt. "The dinner was lovely. But if you'll excuse me, my shift as the dutiful heir is over for the night." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room, my shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. I felt his eyes on my back the entire way out, heavy, cool, and undeniably predatory. He didn't chase me. He didn't say another word. But as I stepped out into the night air and climbed into my car, heading toward the base in the neon lights, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the quiet Enigma hadn't just read me. His fangs had practically thrummed at the scent of my pulse. Chapter 3, After Hours Defiance. The bass at Eclipse didn't just play, it vibrated straight through the soles of my shoes and resonated in my ribs. It was clean, loud, and entirely unapologetic. Exactly what I needed to scrub the heavy scent of rainwater, crushed cedar, and old Coven power out of my lungs. "Jay, you actually made it." Leo yelled over the music, shoving a glass of amber liquid into my hand the second I walked into the private VIP section. "I told you I would," I said, flashing my signature wide smile. I knocked back the shot, the heat burning down my throat and instantly cutting through the lingering chill from the estate. On the floor, under shifting neon lights, I let the music take over. Every pulse of the heavy synth hit like a heartbeat. Every light flare washed away the weight of that stiff, silent dining room. I danced with absolute surrender. With the burn of alcohol settling warm in my veins, I felt light, wild, and completely untamed. This was existence. Feeling your pulse race in sync with 1,000 other people, drinking in the color and the unadulterated energy of the moment. I bought rounds, laughed until my throat was sore, and made sure every camera in the room caught me looking radiant and entirely in control of my own life. If Boston was watching from his dark tower, he was going to see that Jayden Lorenzo doesn't dim his light for anyone. But around 1:30 a.m., when I stepped away from the crowd to grab air on the private balcony overlooking the city, the high started to drop. I leaned against the cold steel railing, looking out over the neon grid below. My scent of bergamot and sea salt was spiked with alcohol and exhaustion now, blooming in the cool midnight breeze. I pulled out my phone, expecting a barrage of angry texts from my father. Instead, there was only one unlisted message sent 30 minutes ago. "Your drivers have been replaced. Step out the side exit when you're finished." My stomach dropped. No threat. No angry lecturing. Just a quiet, absolute directive. I stomped back inside, past Leo with a quick wave, "Catch you Monday," and headed straight down the rear service elevator to avoid the main valet. Who did he think he was? Sending a text like a commanding officer ordering a private back to base? The heavy metal side door clicked open to the quiet alleyway. A sleek, matte black Maybach was idling near the curb, its tinted windows completely opaque under the flickering street lamps. The rear door clicked open automatically from the inside. I walked up, gripping the edge of the door frame, fully prepared to tear into whichever driver he sent. "Tell your boss that I have my own chauffeur and..." I stopped. Sitting in the dim, leather-scented interior of the back seat was Boston himself. He hadn't changed out of the charcoal turtleneck. He sat back in the shadow of the cabin, an open tablet resting on his lap, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the screen and the ambient city lights outside. He looked entirely composed, perfectly comfortable in the late-night quiet, a predator sitting in his natural element. Slowly, Boston tilted his head up, his pale, storm-gray eyes locking onto mine through the dark. I caught the faint, imperceptible flash of deep crimson at the center of his pupils as he registered my blood scent, warm, alcohol-laced bergamot, spilling into the cool cabin air. He didn't breathe it in greedily. He simply held his posture, his jaw setting into a tight line of rigid restraint. "Get in, Jayden," he said softly. His voice carried that low, resonant weight of a vampire enigma, not a barked command, but a statement of reality that seemed to make the air itself heavy. "It's late. And you've made your point. If you are completely hooked on Jayden and Boston's fierce fated connection, Take 2 seconds right now to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications and drop a like on this video. Your support is what keeps original stories like this alive on the channel. Chapter 4, Cold Leather and Unspoken Terms. I stood frozen at the open door for 3 full seconds, the cold midnight air biting through my silk shirt while the heat from the car's interior washed over my legs. Pride screamed at me to slam the door and walk away, but Boston just sat there with infuriating, immovable calm, entirely confident that I would make the rational choice. Sitting in the dim cabin light, every inch of his focused attention was centered purely on me. I gritted my teeth, stepped into the leather cabin and pulled the door closed. The heavy seal clicked shut, instantly cutting off the alleyway noise. The silence inside was immediate, thick, and suffocating. My sudden movement pushed a wave of my scent, bergamot, sea salt, sweat, and alcohol, straight into the back seat. I saw the exact second it hit him. Boston's posture went rigid as stone. His knuckles turned pale, long fingers locking together with unyielding force over his closed tablet. His gray eyes darkened to a pitch-black, predatory abyss as his throat worked in a tight swallow. He didn't move or breathe, drawing on centuries of ironclad discipline to absorb the sharp pull of my blood scent without letting his composure slip. "I have my own driver, Boston," I said, sliding onto the leather seat to keep as much distance as the bench allowed. "Replacing my security detail without asking isn't taking care of anything. It's an invasion." Boston held his breath until the flare of instinct settled. Only then did he ease the tension in his fingers. "Your driver was dismissed at 12:45 a.m. He was intoxicated in the valet lobby. Leaving you to rely on rideshare services while your family's name is splashed across tomorrow's financial news isn't something I intend to permit." I blinked, caught off guard. I could have called a cab. I could have handled it. "You could have," Boston conceded quietly. "Or you could simply sit in a quiet car and let yourself be driven home without making every inconvenience an act of war." A cold spike of annoyance flared. "You don't get to lecture me, Boston. You've been back for less than 24 hours. You don't know me, and you certainly don't get to decide what constitutes a war." Boston shifted, his broad shoulders blocking out the faint neon light filtering through the window. He was meticulously taking in every minor detail, the tremor in my fingers, the way I leaned away, and the rapid flutter of my carotid artery pulsing beneath my silk collar. "I know you work 14-hour shifts to run marketing campaigns that doubled your division's reach last quarter," Boston said quietly, tracking the tense line of my jaw. "I know you haven't slept more than 5 hours a night since Tuesday. And I know your pulse is currently sitting at over 100 beats per minute because you view every quiet moment as a trap." My breath hitched. "How do you?" "I read the reports before I landed," he interrupted softly, turning to the window as the Maybach glided out into the streets. "If we are to be tied together to satisfy our family's ambitions, Jayden, I prefer to understand the structures I am working with." "I am not a structure," I snapped, folding my arms. "I'm a person. And I'm not going to be managed." Boston didn't answer right away, letting the steady hum of the tires fill the space. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, yet it settled directly into the marrow of my bones. "I have no desire to manage you, Jayden," he said calmly. "I simply have no intention of watching you destroy yourself to prove a point to people who aren't even watching." Chapter 5, Unspoken Rules and the Threshold. The rest of the drive passed in a silence so dense and suffocating it felt almost physical. I kept my gaze locked out the window, watching the neon lights of the nightlife district yield to the tall, shadowed monoliths of the financial sector. I kept my arms locked tight across my chest, actively maintaining a posture of complete refusal. Next to me, Boston didn't check his tablet or glance in my direction. He simply sat back in the deep shadow, his broad shoulders relaxed, his storm-gray eyes staring straight ahead. He was entirely at peace with a quiet that was making my nerves fray, a creature who had mastered years of absolute stillness. It was infuriating. My entire life was built on human interaction and visible reaction. I knew how to command a room full of eyes, how to turn anger into charisma, and how to disarm authority with a sharp smile. Boston offered none of those handles. He didn't fight for my attention, nor did he even project the aggressive, territory-marking pheromones most pure-blood alphas used to force a room into compliance. He simply allowed the vacuum between us to exist, content to let me burn out my own anger against his stone wall. My scent was still flaring in defensive bursts through the enclosed space. But instead of overpowering the cabin, it hit his presence and dissipated like spray against granite. His scent remained slow, deep, and immovable, a quiet grounding force in the darkness. When the vehicle turned into the gated courtyard of my high-rise apartment complex, the building's warm exterior spotlights cut through the dark glass of the Maybach. The driver stepped around to open my door, but before I swung my legs out onto the cool marble driveway, I turned back to face Boston. I needed to ensure he knew a smooth car ride didn't mean he had won. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Boston," I said, my voice low and laced with the sharpest edge of my pride. "But if you think pulling up corporate dossiers gives you the right to dictate how I move, you're severely mistaken. I don't fit into neat little blueprints." Boston turned his head slowly. The overhead lighting caught the sharp angle of his jawline and lit up his pale gray eyes. His expression didn't shift into anger or smug satisfaction. There was only that same profound, undivided focus. "I am not playing a game, Jayden," Boston said softly, his voice carrying a deep resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. "And I don't require you to fit into anything. Go inside. Sleep." He didn't wait for my rebuttal or offer an empty farewell. He simply kept his eyes fixed on mine until I stood up into the cool night air. The driver closed the heavy door with a solid, muffled thud. Through the dark tint of the glass, I could still feel his gaze, steady, analytical, and unsettlingly patient. The Maybach pulled away smoothly, its red taillights cutting a clean line through the dark. I stood on the curb as the late-night wind swept away the lingering traces of cedarwood from my clothes. My pulse was still hammering a frantic rhythm, but the surrounding hum of the city felt distant and completely hollow. I walked through the lobby, rode the private elevator, and stepped into my penthouse, tossing my phone onto the marble kitchen island. I had spent the entire night fighting to prove a point, dressing in bold colors, dancing under neon lights, making sure everyone knew I would never bow. Yet as I stood in the center of my vast, quiet living room, one realization echoed louder than all the club's synth bass. Boston Vance hadn't tried to trap me. He hadn't raised his voice or tried to shrink my presence. He had simply looked through my armor, named the exact reason I was running, and let me walk away. And that level of quiet understanding was infinitely more dangerous than any cage my family could ever build. Chapter 6, The First Rule. I woke up at 7:15 a.m. to my phone rattling against the marble nightstand, a sharp hangover parting gift from Eclipse. Squinting against the sunlight, I dragged the screen to my face. A priority email from my father burned against my eyes. 8:30 a.m., Lorenzo Vance Executive Strategy Meeting. Boardroom 4A. Mandatory attendance. Before I could reach the shower, my mother called. "Jayden?" Her voice came through, completely devoid of morning warmth. "I trust you are en route to the tower?" "Heading there now," I said, staring at my reflection. "Though my presence is purely decorative." "Do not play the martyr today," she warned in her cool, Coven acquisition register. "Boston is taking the primary seat on the merger committee. He knows the Vance ledger down to the decimal. Do not go looking for a fight. Boston Vance does not play social games. He will dismantle you before you finish your opening line." By 8:25 a.m., I stepped off the private elevator on the 44th floor, wearing a sharp, double-breasted charcoal suit as armor. When I pushed open the glass of Boardroom 4A, the room was dead quiet. At the head of the long glass conference table sat Boston, infuriatingly composed in a dark navy bespoke suit. His storm-gray eyes were scanning a leather dossier while executives spoke in hushed tones around him. I took my seat near the middle. Boston's eyes flicked to mine for a fraction of a second, acknowledging my arrival without a word before returning to his files. 10 minutes in, the discussion turned to my division's projections. Arthur, an older alpha executive who had been with my father for 30 years, gestured to a chart. Q3 expenditure for the lifestyle sector ran 12% over budget. Jayden's team pushed an aggressive campaign that relied too heavily on high-cost influencer partnerships. It's an expensive, volatile approach that yields soft metrics rather than hard institutional capital. I sat up, fingers locking around my pen. "Arthur, those soft metrics resulted in a 42% increase in brand retention among demographics under 35, which directly drove." "It's an unnecessary burn rate ahead of the merger," Arthur interrupted dismissively. I opened my mouth to tear into his logic, but a low, smooth voice cut cleanly through the room. "You're evaluating the campaign using the wrong metric, Arthur." The boardroom went dead silent. Boston slowly folded his hands over his dossier and turned his storm-gray gaze directly onto the senior vice president. "Jayden's division incurred a 12% front-end capital spike," Boston said with cold, mathematical precision. "However, the customer acquisition cost dropped by 34% over a 90-day cycle. The organic reach doubled projections by 6 weeks. You are measuring short-term expenditure against a long-term yield structure. If you cut that budget, you reduce the brand's enterprise value before the public announcement by roughly $18 million. Arthur stared at Boston, his jaw tightening. I sat frozen, my pen suspended in midair. Boston hadn't defended me with emotional appeals. He had simply used my raw numbers to crush an industry dinosaur. Arthur swallowed hard, adjusting his cuffs. With all due respect, Mr. Vance, you have been living abroad in quiet isolation. Perhaps you should allow those of us in the trenches to determine what is practical for daily operations. The air in the room plummeted. Boston didn't blink or shift. He simply stared at Arthur with an immovable, absolute focus that made every executive hold their breath. I didn't spend those years away from this company, Boston said softly, his voice carrying a quiet resonance that settled into the glass walls. I spent those years preparing to take responsibility for it. If you cannot read a modern balance sheet, Arthur, I will find someone who can. Arthur went pale, nodded once, and clicked to the next slide without another word. During the mid-morning recess, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, looking out over the city skyline to process what had just happened. A faint scent of rainwater and crushed cedar stepped into my air space. Boston stopped 2 paces away, holding a dark porcelain espresso cup, looking out over the city with that same impenetrable calm. You didn't have to defend my division, I said quietly, keeping my eyes on the skyline. I wasn't defending you, Boston replied smoothly, taking a sip of his espresso. I turned my head to glare at him. You made that very clear. Your numbers were correct, Boston said, his pale eyes shifting to meet mine with absolute directness. I don't allow poor logic to dictate strategy, regardless of who is presenting it. He turned on his heel and walked away before I could respond, leaving me gritting my teeth against an unsettling realization. The man was infuriating, but he was brilliant. By 4 p.m., after the board session concluded, our parents entered the private executive suite. My father stood by the mahogany desk, holding a printed copy of the joint press release detailing our formal engagement announcement. We publish at 8 a.m. Monday, my father stated, placing the paper down with a heavy thud. The market needs to see stability before the stock exchange opens. Absolutely not, I said immediately, crossing my arms. You are rushing this to control the narrative. I haven't agreed to the public timeline. My father's expression darkened. Jayden, this is not a negotiation. We establish terms first. Boston's low voice cut across the room, stopping my father instantly. Boston stood up from his armchair and walked to the desk. He laid the press release aside and turned his complete focus toward me. If this arrangement is to function without destroying the operational integrity of either firm, Boston said quietly, looking directly into my eyes, we set the ground rules now. Starting with privacy. I narrowed my eyes. Meaning what? Meaning you don't interfere with my private life, Boston laid out calmly. And I don't interfere with yours. You want to go out? Go. You want to work late? Work. You want to see your friends? See them. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to find the trap. And what's the condition? Boston stepped closer, his storm gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that pulled all the ambient noise out of the room. If you're in danger, Boston said softly, his voice carrying an immovable promise, you tell me. I stood there in the quiet office, surrounded by the heavy weight of expectations, looking at the one man I had been prepared to fight to the death. He hadn't asked for my submission or built a cage. He had simply offered freedom, demanded truth, and left the door wide open. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I had no idea how to fight back. Chapter 7, The 6-Week Clock. 48 hours after the press release dropped, the floor gave out completely. I stood in the library of my family's estate, gripping a mahogany armchair while our parents sat around the tea table like a council of war. 6 weeks, my father announced, setting down his china cup with a sharp clink. October 12th. That secures the combined capital release before Q4 closes. 6 weeks. I repeated in disbelief. The press release went out 2 days ago. We haven't even finalized the merger terms for my division. You want an international wedding in 6 weeks? The market is already speculating, Boston's mother interjected smoothly. An engagement buys time. A wedding creates absolute permanence. Investors want permanence. I don't give a damn about investors, I snapped. We barely know each other. My father looked up, entirely devoid of sympathy. That is why you have 6 weeks. Unbelievable, I breathed, turning toward the hallway ready to tear out of the house. Wait. A low, quiet command cut through the room. I stopped. The sheer weight of Boston's voice pulled my gaze back. He sat near the end of the sofa, looking infuriatingly unbothered. He set his tablet down and met my eyes with steady calm. They're trying to control the timeline because they believe we're too unstable to control ourselves. I narrowed my eyes. And? We give them nothing to control. Boston stood up, towering over the room in a charcoal turtleneck. He walked toward me, stopping just outside my personal space. If we allow our families to build this timeline, they will manage every hour of our lives. If we take the initiative, they lose their leverage. I crossed my arms defensively. And how do you propose we take the initiative? We spend the next 6 weeks together, Boston said evenly. Publicly. Privately. On our own terms. 6 weeks is enough time to determine whether we can coexist. Coexist? I mocked. Boston stared down at me, his pale eyes unwavering. Would you prefer date? The word hung in the quiet air, heavy and unexpected. My throat went dry. The man was being completely, terrifyingly serious. Why would you even want to spend more time with me? I demanded softly. You don't even like the noise that follows me. Boston paused, his gaze lingering until my chest tightened under the focus. Because I don't intend to marry a stranger, he said simply. By 8 p.m. that Friday I decided to test him. If Boston Vance wanted to enter my world, I was going to make him endure the loudest, most chaotic corner of it. I had my driver drop us off at the edge of the night market near the docks, a sprawling maze of neon street food stalls, crowded vinyl shops, and live jazz bleeding out of underground basements. You're going to ruin those $800 boots? I said, looking back over my shoulder with a sharp grin. Boston stepped out of the black sedan behind me, wearing a simple black coat over a dark shirt. He looked completely out of place against the raw, pulsing energy of the dockside market. For an introverted vampire Enigma, a street market like this was a sensory assault. The shrieking metal of the elevated train, clattering walks, and the overlapping din of hundreds of voices slammed against his heightened instincts all at once. His dark brows drew tight as his eyes scanned the dense crowd with immediate razor-sharp alertness. Yet as I wove through the throng, Boston stepped closer into my wake. He tilted his head, taking a slow, deep breath, pulling my scent into his lungs, bergamot and sea salt. In the middle of the sensory chaos, my scent acted as his golden anchor, cutting through the static of the city and centering his focus. He didn't complain. He didn't ask to leave. Lead the way, Boston said calmly. For 2 hours I tried to rattle him. I dragged him through crowded stalls, weaving through throngs of people. Every time someone pushed past us, Boston was simply there. A broad, solid barrier stepping between me and the crowd without ever touching me unnecessarily, his presence cutting through the chaos like a silent shield. I stopped at an old, subterranean record shop tucked beneath a noodle house. The room was tiny, warm, and packed with crates of original pressings, light jazz humming softly from an old turntable in the corner. I dropped down on my knees, flipping through a crate of 1970s soul records, temporarily forgetting he was even standing behind me. Find something? Boston's quiet voice floated down. An original pressing of Roy Ayers, I said, holding up the dusty sleeve tracing the worn cardboard cover. A genuine smile broke across my face before I could filter it away. My grandfather had this on vinyl. It's almost impossible to find in clean condition. Boston didn't look at the album. He looked at my face. His pale eyes absorbed the way my expression had shifted. The light in my eyes, the relaxed posture, the complete absence of defensive armor. He stood in the dim lighting, his silence dense and hyper-focused, recording every detail. When I stepped toward the counter to ask the owner about the pressing, Boston remained near the vinyl crates. Across the narrow shop, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the back of my neck, his cool composure hardening into something raw, ancient, and terrifyingly intense. Behind his calm facade, a dark fire flared beneath his iris. Jayden had no idea. He didn't know that years ago, when Boston first encountered him at a public gala, his Enigma instincts had recognized his golden anchor so violently his fangs had nearly descended. Boston had been sent to Europe because his Enigma hunger threatened to go feral around the child. His coven elders had spent 22 years training him in absolute containment, forcing him to master total emotional suppression before he was ever allowed to stand in the same room as Jayden again. Now, watching 30-year-old Jayden smile over an old record, Boston drew in another quiet breath of bergamot and sea salt, forcing the dark heat down and locking the monster back behind its cage. When we left the shop 20 minutes later, I reached into my coat for my wallet to pay a street vendor for 2 hot teas, only to find the vendor already nodding at Boston. Already taken care of, the vendor said. I frowned. I pay for my own things. I know, Boston said, taking a sip from a plain paper cup. He didn't have change for 100. I gritted my teeth, but as we walked down the pier toward the water, the quiet settled over us. The cool harbor wind swept over the concrete, carrying his faint scent, rainwater and crushed cedar, wrapping subtly around us. You hate crowds, I said quietly, leaning against the rusty iron railing and looking out over the dark water. Why didn't you say anything? Because you like them, Boston replied. He stopped beside me, leaning his forearms against the rail, staring at the city lights reflecting over the black waves. You like places where you can disappear. I turned my head to look at him, my breath catching. What? In a boardroom, everyone is staring at you, Boston laid out smoothly, his voice dropping into that deep resonance. At dinner, your parents watch every move you make. Here, nobody cares who your father is. You get to breathe. I stared at the side of his sharp jawline. He hadn't just endured the night. He had been observing, calculating, understanding. He turned his head, his storm-gray eyes trapping mine in the dim amber street light. You don't have to perform for me, Jayden, Boston said softly. I'm not your audience. He didn't reach out to touch me. He didn't lean in. He simply offered the truth wrapped in that quiet, absolute stability, and left it lying between us. And as I looked at him under the cold dock lights, the knot of anger I had carried in my chest for weeks began to unravel into something far more dangerous: curiosity. Chapter 8, The Quiet Pursuit. I woke up on Monday morning with Boston's parting words still ringing in my head like a persistent fever. You don't have to perform for me, Jayden. I'm not your audience. It irritated me how easily he had seen through me. My entire life had been a carefully staged show, the charismatic heir, the untouchable Omega. Yet this man who spoke with such quiet, blunt honesty had looked right past the act. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Boston. Dinner Thursday, 7:30. I stared at the screen. No pleasantries. Just a plain, direct message. I typed back, is that an invitation or a corporate summons? A beat later, his reply flashed across the screen. An invitation. You can say no. That line, you can say no, hung in the air. He wasn't backing me into a corner. He was leaving the choice entirely to me. A subtle, frustrating smile tugged at the corner of my lips. By 7:30 on Thursday, I was standing outside L'Ambra, a quiet bistro with no flash, no paparazzi, and zero corporate ties to our families. Why here? I asked as the host led us to a quiet leather booth in the back. I assumed you'd pick somewhere with a 3-month waiting list. You said you like places where nobody knows who you are, Boston said calmly, unbuttoning his coat. He had actually remembered. Before I could even open the menu, the waiter set a glass down in front of me, a smoked bourbon neat with 2 drops of orange bitters. Exactly how I drank it when I was off the clock and not drinking to impress anyone. I raised an eyebrow. How did you know? You ordered it twice last week at the executive lounge, Boston replied smoothly, taking a sip of water. I pay attention. A warm, strange tension settled in my chest. He wasn't just managing an arrangement, he was paying attention to me as a person. All right, Boston, I said, leaning forward on my elbows. What do you actually do when you aren't running meetings? I work, Boston said. Besides work, I pushed. What do you do when you're by yourself? Boston paused, his storm-gray eyes holding mine. I restore old pocket watches. 19th century pieces mostly. The mechanics are precise. Tiny gears, mainsprings, hands. If one small piece is off, the whole thing stops. Why watches? I asked softly, intrigued. They keep moving whether anyone is watching them or not, Boston said. They don't need a crowd. The words hit a quiet spot inside me. There was no pretense in him, just absolute, grounded truth. The next afternoon I found a heavy black box sitting on my desk. Inside lay the original pressing of the Roy Ayers vinyl from the waterfront shop. The worn cover had been carefully cleaned and placed in an archival sleeve, accompanied by a card in Boston's neat handwriting, for when the noise gets too loud. My thumb traced the smooth cover as my heart gave a sudden, dangerous thud. He had actually sent someone back to track down that shopkeeper and buy it for me. My phone rang. It was Leo. Tell me you're free for lunch, Leo said the moment I answered. I need an update on the brooding vampire. I'm at my desk, I muttered, still staring at the album. And he doesn't brood. He's just insanely focused. You've gone out with him twice this week, Leo pointed out dryly. Jayden, You keep telling me this is just a fake arrangement. Because it is, I insisted. Then why are you smiling at a record? Leo asked softly. I froze, catching my reflection in the dark computer screen, and immediately flattened my mouth. I'm not smiling. Right? Leo replied, his tone growing gentle. Just be careful, Jay. Men like Boston Vance don't do things by halves. If he's pursuing you, he's doing it for keeps. That evening was the Vanguard Gala, our first formal public appearance as an officially engaged couple. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a bright sea of crystal chandeliers and tailored tuxedos. The moment we stepped off the private elevator, reporters shifted their focus toward us. Boston stood beside me, effortless in a black suit. He didn't force his hand onto my waist for the cameras, he simply stood beside me, a solid, unshakable presence. As we moved through the floor, Julian Croft, a partner from a rival firm, stepped directly into our path with a patronizing smirk. Jayden, darling. And the elusive Boston Vance, Julian said, his tone dripping with fake warmth. We all assumed Jayden was far too high maintenance to ever settle down. How are you handling the leash, Boston? The air around us turned ice cold. I opened my mouth to tear Julian's reputation to shreds, but before I could say a word, Boston stepped forward. His tall frame blocked out the light above Julian. He didn't raise his voice and he didn't drop a defensive threat. He simply looked down at the man with absolute, freezing authority. Jayden doesn't wear a leash, Julian, Boston said softly, his voice carrying a quiet, lethal weight. And if you ever confuse his independence for weakness again, I will personally pull your fund's line of credit before the markets open on Monday. Julian turned pale, swallowed hard, and backed away into the crowd without another word. I stood there, my pulse racing as I looked up at Boston's sharp profile. I had that under control, I murmured. I know, Boston replied smoothly, his gray eyes meeting mine. You didn't need my help. But nobody speaks to you like that in my presence. We walked toward the terrace to get away from the noise, the cool night air washing over us. As a group of guests stepped through the doors, someone bumped hard against my shoulder. Before I could lose my balance, Boston's large, warm hand settled firmly against the small of my back, steadying me instantly. The heat of his palms sank straight through my velvet jacket. His protective instincts flared subtly, his shoulders broadening as his eyes scanned the crowd. My breath hitched, my pulse spiking at how close he was. The second I regained my footing, his hand slid away, leaving a lingering warm pressure behind. Are you all right? Boston asked quietly. Fine, I breathed, hyper-aware of how close he was standing, his familiar scent wrapping around me. A long pause stretched between us. I like watching you when you're comfortable, Boston said simply. The words wrecked every defense I had left. No smooth line. Just simple, absolute sincerity. When I finally got back to my penthouse at midnight, I collapsed onto the sofa, completely exhausted. My phone buzzed on the coffee table with a text from Boston. Home? Yes, I typed back. A second later, his reply illuminated the screen. Good night, Jayden. I dropped the phone onto my chest and stared up at the high ceiling. This was supposed to be a strategic, controlled arrangement to keep our families from dictating our lives. So why was I already wondering when I would see Boston again? Chapter 9. Through his eyes. By Wednesday, the silence in my penthouse had grown too loud. For 3 days, I had tried to push Boston out of my mind. I buried myself in quarterly marketing forecasts, stayed late at the office, and answered emails long after everyone else had gone home. It didn't work. Every time the room went quiet, I heard his voice from the terrace. I like watching you when you're comfortable. He hadn't texted since Sunday. No good morning. No check-in. No carefully calculated excuse to see me. Nothing. And somehow, that bothered me more than it should have. He had left the door open. So, at 8 o'clock that evening, I decided to walk through it. I had my driver take me to Boston's private residential tower in the historic district. The building was exactly what I expected from him, discreet, old money, and completely uninterested in being noticed. When the private elevator opened directly into his loft, I stepped out expecting the same cold, intimidating atmosphere I associated with him. I was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not the heavy silence of a boardroom waiting for someone to speak. This silence felt deliberate. Soft lighting spilled across rich dark oak floors. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covered one wall, packed with old hardcovers and leather-bound volumes. Low leather furniture sat arranged around a quiet sitting area, while tall windows overlooked the distant city lights. Nothing glittered. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing seemed designed to impress anyone. It felt less like a billionaire's home and more like a place where someone had finally learned how to breathe. Boston stood near a long work table in the corner, wearing a black crewneck sweater with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. A precision magnifying visor rested pushed up on his dark hair, and tiny brass tools were arranged across a green felt mat beneath a single desk lamp. For a moment I simply watched him. This was the man everyone described as untouchable. The vampire Enigma. The terrifying heir who could silence a boardroom without raising his voice. And here he was, alone beneath a warm pool of lamplight, carefully repairing something that looked small enough to disappear between my fingers. He turned. His pale, storm-gray eyes found mine immediately. He didn't look surprised. "You came," Boston said. It wasn't a question. I slipped my coat from my shoulders and draped it over the back of an armchair. I was curious. A faint flicker passed through his eyes. "About?" I glanced toward the work table. "You." Boston set down his tool, walked over to a small side table and poured 2 glasses of water. He walked back and handed one to me, his fingers briefly brushing mine as I took it. The immediate, solid heat of his touch sank straight into my skin. "Is this where you go to escape?" I asked, leaning against the edge of his desk. "It's where I go to focus," Boston corrected gently, gesturing toward a disassembled pocket watch, tiny gears no larger than freckles laid out in neat rows on the green felt. "You can really sit here for hours?" I asked, stepping closer to inspect the mechanism. "Don't you get restless?" Boston glanced up at me, his pale gray eyes completely steady. "Not when something holds my interest." I looked down at the delicate brass gears, then back at him. "The watch." His gaze stayed locked on mine, unblinking and intense. "Not tonight." The room seemed to shrink instantly. My breath caught in my throat. For the first time, I wondered if I had misunderstood his silence all along. Boston wasn't cold or void of feeling. He simply didn't waste his energy on empty performances. Boston reached out. Slowly, giving me every opportunity to step back, he raised his hand and used 2 fingers to gently brush a loose lock of hair away from my forehead. The warmth of his skin sent a quiet shiver straight down my spine. "I knew what you were the moment you sat across from me at that first contract dinner," Boston said softly. "And what was I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Exhausted," Boston answered simply. "You were carrying the weight of 2 families, a division and an image, pretending you enjoyed every second of it. You were surrounded by people who loved what you looked like, but nobody was actually paying attention to you." My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. I stared at him, my throat dry, completely stripped of my usual quick-witted defenses. His thumb rested briefly against the line of my jaw, warm, solid, and grounding. "I watch you, Jayden," he added quietly. Something deep inside my chest finally gave way. "I know," I whispered. He let his hand fall slowly, turning back to the work table as if he hadn't just completely altered the foundation of our entire relationship. He picked up a pair of fine tweezers. "Come here," Boston said gently, gesturing to the leather chair beside him. "Let me show you how the escape will fit." I stood there for a second, my heart hammering a steady rhythm against my ribs. For as long as I could remember, people had demanded my energy, my charm, and my constant performance. I had always assumed that closeness meant noise, grandiose declarations, and constantly managing someone else's expectations. Yet sitting here in Boston's world, surrounded by dark oak, warm lamplight, and an unshakable stillness, a quiet realization settled over me. Boston was the only man who had ever offered me a space where I didn't have to carry any of it. I didn't leave. I walked over, pulled out the leather chair beside him, and sat down. Chapter 10, The Quiet Current. By Saturday morning, the city was entirely gone. Boston hadn't asked where I wanted to go. He simply picked me up at 6 a.m., drove us 2 hours north into the mountains, and brought us to a private timber and stone lodge on the edge of a glass-still lake, miles away from the nearest paved road. Out here, stripped of his tailored suits and executive posture, Boston looked entirely different in a dark flannel, work boots, and heavy denim. His effortless, practical ease made my pulse do strange, dangerous things. By mid-afternoon, the sun sat low over the trees, painting the water in muted streaks of gold and slate. "I've never been fishing in my life," I admitted, standing on the edge of the wooden dock while Boston prepped a small motorboat. Boston looked up, his pale gray eyes assessing me with calm focus. "Good thing I'm a good teacher." 10 minutes later, we were anchored in the quiet center of the lake. The world shrank down to the gentle lap of water against the hull and the sharp scent of pine. "Keep your elbow tucked," Boston said softly, stepping behind me as I struggled to cast the line without tangling it. He didn't hesitate. He stepped in close, his chest brushing against my back, his broad shoulders blocking out the chill mountain wind. He reached down, his large, calloused hands completely covering mine on the cork handle of the rod. The heat of his body burned through my jacket, immediate and absolute. "Relax your wrist," Boston murmured into the shell of my ear, his voice a low rumble. "You're trying to control it. Just let the weight carry the line." My breath hitched. "I don't like not being in control." "I know," Boston replied gently. He guided my arm back, then smoothly forward. The line unspooled cleanly, dropping into the deep green water with a faint plink. He didn't step away immediately. For a long beat, he stayed anchored right behind me, his breathing steady against the side of my neck. His scent, rainwater, cedar, and that deep Enigma undertone, wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. "See," Boston whispered. "It's easy when you stop fighting it." By evening, a roaring fire cracked inside the lodge's massive stone hearth, casting amber shadows across the dark oak floors. We sat side by side on the leather sofa, a thick woolen blanket stretched over our knees. For an hour, neither of us said a word. In the past, silence with anyone else meant failure, a sign that I wasn't being entertaining enough. With Boston, the quiet felt like sanctuary. "What are you thinking about?" Boston asked softly, cutting through the crackle of the fireplace. I stared into the flames, tracing the edge of the blanket with my thumb. "About how weird this is. For as long as I can remember, I spent my time learning how to entertain people so they wouldn't look too closely. And you just sit here. You don't ask for a performance." "I don't want a performance," Boston said calmly. He reached over and took my hand, his grip firm, warm, and steady. "I don't care about the heir to the Lorenzo family, Jayden. I don't care about the board members, the galas, or what our parents want. I only care about the man sitting on this couch." My throat went dry. My heart gave an irregular thud against my ribs. "Boston." "I don't do things halfway," Boston continued softly, his thumb rubbing small circles over the back of my hand. "I don't waste my time on temporary things. If I'm here, I'm all in." The quiet weight of his words settled over me, stripping away every last piece of armor I had left. There was no game here. No contract. Just Boston. And me. "I know," I breathed, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the wood. Boston raised his free hand. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers cupped the side of my face. His palm was warm against my skin, his thumb resting over the curve of my cheekbone. He leaned in, giving me every second to pull back, to retreat into the safety of our fake arrangement. I didn't move. I closed the remaining distance myself. When his lips met mine, the breath was knocked straight out of my lungs. It was deep, raw, and possessive, the physical demand of an enigma who had waited, watched, and quietly claimed his person. His hand slid around my waist to pull me flush against his chest. My hands found his shoulders, clinging to his heavy wool sweater as his scent of white amber, rainwater, and crushed cedar flooded my senses in an intoxicating rush. He kissed me until the world disappeared. When he finally pulled back a fraction of an inch, his forehead rested against mine. His breathing was heavy, his pale eyes wild. "You're mine, Jayden," Boston whispered, his voice dark and rough. "Not because they arranged it. Because you chose me." My heart pounded violently. The words were on the tip of my tongue. "I'm yours, Boston." I parted my lips to say it, but Boston's thumb brushed gently across my lower lip, hushing me. The possessive edge in his eyes softened into a careful, weary patience. "Don't say it yet," Boston murmured softly. "Not until you know the whole truth. Not until you understand what you're stepping into, and how long I've been waiting for you." I blinked, confused. "Boston, what are you talking about?" He held my fingers tightly against his pulse. "The contract 6 weeks ago wasn't a coincidence. My presence wasn't corporate expansion. The families wanted a merger, but I quietly made sure that every clause had you attached to it, so I could finally get my anchor. 22 years ago, I walked into a garden at a public estate gala. I was a teenager and very volatile, my vampire instincts burning through my control. I was dangerous, Jayden." He leaned closer, his eyes steady. "And then I caught your scent. You were 8 years old, playing near the fountain. My vampire nature recognized you as my golden anchor. The instinct was immediate, possessive, absolute. The single person whose presence could quiet my hunger. But you were a child." The room went completely still, the crackle of the fire sounded miles away. 8 years old. I whispered, my voice trembling. "You knew me then?" "My blood recognized you," Boston corrected softly. But I would not act on it. You were a child, unaware, unburdened, and innocent. So I turned around and left. For 22 years, I breathed. For 22 years, Boston affirmed quietly. I removed myself from the continent. I spent 2 decades undergoing brutal discipline to master my vampire biology and my hunger, so that if I ever returned, I would never pose a threat to you. I swore I would not step back into your life until you were a grown man, with your own mind, choices, and strength. His fingers gently brushed against my cheekbone, his touch agonizingly tender. I waited until now, until you were a man with your own choices, so I could court you properly. I wanted you to choose me not because my blood called to yours, but because Jayden Lorenzo wanted Boston Vance. Silence stretched between us, heavy with 2 decades of restraint. I sat frozen on the leather sofa, processing the terrifying scope of what he had carried in secret. Every quiet moment, every time he had simply sat beside me without demanding anything from me, it hadn't just been patience. It had been 22 years of self-mastery to give me a fair choice. I looked at the man holding my face, the Enigma executive who had conquered his own monstrous instincts just to give me the dignity of an uncoerced decision. Now you know, Boston whispered, his eyes searching mine with absolute honesty. I won't accept your surrender based on an illusion. The choice is yours, Jayden. Completely yours. Chapter 11, No Longer Pretending. The morning light arrived soft and hazy, casting a pale glow over the lake outside. When I woke up, the cabin was quiet except for the steady, distant lap of water against the dock. For as long as I could remember, my mornings followed an automatic script, preparing a charming performance. Waking up always felt like putting on heavy armor. Today, lying beneath the thick wool blanket with the scent of cedar and morning rain in the air, my chest felt unburdened. I felt safe, a completely unfamiliar sensation I didn't have to calculate or perform for. I sat up. Boston was already awake, standing near the kitchen counter in a charcoal crewneck sweater, pouring hot water into a ceramic coffee dripper. He turned when he heard my footsteps, his storm-gray eyes meeting mine with calm, undivided focus. He handed me a black coffee with a splash of milk, exactly how I drank it without me ever having to say a word. "Sleep well?" Boston asked softly. "Surprisingly well," I admitted, taking a slow sip as the heat settled in my chest. I looked out at the quiet expanse of the lake, then turned my gaze back to him. "Boston? I don't think I want 6 weeks anymore." Boston stopped, his hand resting on the counter. His pale eyes locked onto mine, steady, reading every layer of my face. "What do you want?" I set my mug down. The quiet around us didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like a foundation. "You," I said simply. Boston didn't offer a long response. He reached across the small distance, his large, warm hand covering mine, fingers lacing firmly. "Then we stopped counting the weeks," Boston said, his voice low and absolute. By 4 p.m. we were back in the city. The transition from the quiet mountain lake to the private dining room of the Grand Regency felt like stepping into an entirely different universe, heavy with polished mahogany and the suffocating aura of family expectations. My parents sat on one side of the long table armed with timelines. Boston's father sat across from them, reviewing press releases with a cold, analytical eye. In the past, I would have taken a seat directly across from Boston, maintaining the calculated distance and playing my assigned role in the theater of alliances. Every instinct urged me to stick to the script. But then I looked at Boston, sitting with that same unshakable poise, unbothered by the boardroom theater. For as long as I can remember, I sat where people expected me to. Today I'm choosing where I stand. I walked straight past the empty seat across from him, pulled out the leather chair directly beside Boston, and sat down. My father paused, his pen hovering. Boston's father looked up, a subtle flicker of surprise crossing his features. Boston didn't move. He reached over without a word, took the crystal water carafe, and filled my glass before filling his own, an instinctive gesture of effortless familiarity. When I leaned back, my hand naturally rested on Boston's arm. I felt the steady heat of his muscle under his jacket. He didn't pull away, instead his hand found mine under the table edge, his thumb briefly stroking my wrist. My mother set her teacup down with a soft, delicate click. She looked at my softened posture, at the absence of my hypervigilant smile, and at the unscripted way Boston's shoulder brushed against mine. A small, gentle smile touched her lips. "I knew this would work, Jay," she murmured softly. "You needed balance. Someone who lets you just be." The room went dead quiet. My father cleared his throat, setting his pen down. We've finalized the press schedule for the formal engagement announcement next Thursday. The legal teams have aligned on the asset structuring, and we need to lock in the venue deposit if we want to maintain the October timeline. He leaned forward, searching my face. Unless, of course, either of you feels we need to adjust the pace of this arrangement. I looked at my father without reaching for the defensive charm I used to hide behind. We're still getting married, I said, my voice calm and even. My father relaxed back into his chair, a satisfied smile forming. Good. Then the rollout remains on schedule. But you're not planning our relationship anymore? I interrupted smoothly. The room froze. My father's smile vanished instantly. I didn't raise my voice or look rebellious. I just spoke the plain truth of a man who had finally stepped out from behind the armor. Boston turned his head slightly, his pale gray eyes settling on my father as his hand tightened around mine beneath the table. The wedding can remain October 12th, Boston said quietly. Everything else is ours. My father stared at us for a long, heavy moment, searching for a fracture or a negotiation point, a sign that this was still something he could control. He found none. The families had arranged the marriage. We had chosen each other. I looked at Boston, feeling the steady warmth of his hand around mine. For the first time in my life, the future didn't look like a contract. It looked like home. Chapter 12, October 12th. The morning of October 12th was ironically clear and quiet. There were 300 guests waiting downstairs in the glass atrium, governors, board chairs, and press treating a union like a corporate acquisition. In the dressing suite, my father stood adjusting his cuffs. The press release goes out in 10 minutes. The stock options vest at market open tomorrow. Those words used to send a spike of adrenaline through my chest. Today I stood adjusting my charcoal tie with completely steady hands. I know, I replied calmly. My father turned, searching my face for the familiar tightness. He found nothing, just a settled stillness. When the oak doors opened, it wasn't my father who led the walk down the corridor. It was just me. The ceremony was brief, elegant, and perfectly executed for the cameras. But none of the public theater mattered. What mattered happened on the altar when Boston stepped up beside me. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit, his storm gray eyes locked onto mine the second I reached the top step. When the officiant asked for the rings, Boston didn't look at the crowd. He reached down, slipping the heavy platinum band onto my finger, his thumb resting over my knuckle. No contracts, Boston murmured softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. I looked at him, feeling the steady heat of his hand, and slipped the matching band onto his finger. No contracts, I agreed. When he kissed me, it wasn't for the photographers. It was deep, grounding, and absolute, the quiet seal on a promise made weeks ago by the lake. By midnight, the noise of the reception faded. We slipped away from the ballroom before the last guests could corner us, leaving the handlers, photographers, and political speeches behind. Boston's private penthouse was dark, lit only by the distant amber glow of the skyline. I loosened my tie, tossing it onto an armchair. The silence felt heavy, rich, and real. Boston walked up behind me, stepping into my space. Tired? He asked softly, his voice a low rumble. A little, I admitted, turning to face him. Mainly just glad it's over. It's just us now, Boston said, raising a hand to brush his thumb along the side of my neck until his palm rested warm against my skin. I could feel the cool line of his wedding band right over my pulse. His eyes held mine in the quiet shadow, no walls up. Just him looking at me like I was the only thing that mattered. No audience, I said, leaning into his hand. Boston softened, a faint trace of a smile touching his mouth. Not anymore. He leaned down, pressing his lips to mine. The kiss began slow and unhurried. My hands found their way to his chest, fingers resting against his suit jacket as he pulled me closer, eliminating every fraction of space. His other hand slid down to my waist, firm and possessive, anchoring me to him as his familiar scent, rainwater, cedar, bergamot, and sea salt, enveloped my senses. He unbuttoned my vest with effortless ease, guiding me back toward the bed. It was the quiet, confident rhythm of two people who belonged to each other. When we hit the mattress, Boston leaned over me, his weight a comforting, solid warmth. He rested his forehead against mine, his dark lashes casting soft shadows. "You're home, Jayden," he whispered against my lips. His breath against the shell of my ear grew hot, his storm-gray eyes shifting into a deeper, darker silver as his ancient instincts surged. The sharp, metallic tang of his Enigma power filled the room, wild and demanding, yet entirely controlled for me. Slowly, deliberately, Boston moved his lips down to the exposed curve of my shoulder, right where my pulse thrummed fast and clear. His fangs extended with a sharp, subtle ache against my skin. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, offering me one final silent moment. "Do it," I whispered, tilting my head back. "Take what's yours." A low, primal growl reverberated deep within Boston's chest. He didn't rush. With precise, possessive reverence, his fangs pierced the skin over my pulse point. A sharp, electric shock ran down my spine, quickly dissolving into an overwhelming wave of warmth and pleasure. The golden anchor connection flared to life, a biological circuit closing after 22 years of waiting. Boston drank. It wasn't violent, it was an intimate, sacred exchange. As he took his share of my blood, the centuries of storm and ancient hunger inside him suddenly fell away. The volatile rage of an Enigma vampire vanished, replaced by an absolute, profound peace. His entire body relaxed over mine, anchored completely by the blood of the person he had protected and waited for. When he finally pulled back, he licked the tiny droplets from my skin with agonizing tenderness, sealing the mark. His eyes were dark, glazed with satisfaction, quiet fulfillment, and unyielding devotion. He leaned down close, his dark, heavy gaze locking onto mine. "Mine," Boston whispered, his voice dark, rough, and thoroughly at peace against my skin. "Finally, mine." The possessive rumble of his voice sent a dizzying flutter of butterflies exploding through my chest and straight down to my stomach. My heart hammered against my ribs, wild and breathless under his gaze. "Yours?" I echoed softly. Boston didn't wait. He captured my mouth in a kiss that was fundamentally different from before, intoxicating, heavy, and drunk on the bond now sealed between us. The taste of my own blood on his tongue merged with rainwater and cedar, a heady, overwhelming rush that made my head spin. A quiet gasp escaped my throat into his mouth. I reached up, my hands sliding up his back and burying deeply into his dark, thick hair. I gripped his hair tight, pulling him down harder against me, anchoring him close so there wasn't a breath of space left between us. Boston groaned into the kiss, his broad frame pressing down, surrounding me completely in his warmth, his scent, and his absolute presence. And as the city hummed far below us, the rest of the world washed away entirely into the quiet, absolute warmth of the night. Epilogue: Domestic silence. 2 years later. The rain fell in steady sheets against the bay window of our townhouse on the edge of the city. Inside, the living room smelled like damp pine, fresh cedar, and the deep Enigma warmth Boston left on every surface. It wasn't the calculated scent of an arrangement anymore. It was safety, the atmosphere I breathed when I didn't have to pretend. On the rug by the fireplace, Coco, our massive, cloud-soft Samoyed, let out a contented sigh in her sleep. I sat on the deep leather sofa, leaning back against the cushions. My laptop sat dark beside a half-finished manuscript. For as long as I could remember, silence in a house meant tension. The heavy stillness before someone demanded I fit into their box. Now silence was just peace. Boston walked out of the kitchen wearing a dark charcoal sweater with the sleeves pushed up. He didn't ask if I needed reassurance. He simply sat down beside me, setting a warm mug on the coaster. Black coffee for him, warm milk and honey for me. Without a word, he stretched one arm over the back of the couch, his deep Enigma presence flaring softly. The warmth settled over me and my body relaxed instantly. He reached down, his large, solid hand settling gently over the pronounced swell of my stomach. My breath caught softly as the heat of his palm sank through my shirt. Beneath his fingers, a gentle, tiny flutter answered his touch. Boston's thumb began a slow, deliberate stroke across my bump, his storm-gray eyes softening with unshakable, quiet pride. For so long, I thought my life would be written in boardrooms and contracts. A series of expectations handed down by people who only loved the image of me. I looked down at his wedding band resting over my stomach, then up at his face. I used to wear armor every morning just to survive. Now I don't even need the shield. "How's the ending?" Boston asked softly, his voice a low rumble against my side. "Finished," I murmured, leaning my head against his shoulder and letting my hand rest over his on my stomach. It turns out the ending was the easiest part. Boston turned his head slightly, pressing a slow kiss to my temple as Coco stretched near our feet. "Good," he whispered, his fingers lacing through mine over our child. "Then you can rest." I closed my eyes, sinking deep into the steady beat of his heart, the soft breath of our dog by the fire, and the small, incredible life growing inside me. Out in the world, corporate empires still clashed and the press still speculated. But inside these four walls, beneath the quiet hum of the rain, none of it could touch us. We hadn't just survived the arrangement. We had built a home. The end. If this chapter gave you all the feelings, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with fellow BL lovers, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. Where are you listening from today? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from you.